As quilters, finishing a quilt is such a sense of accomplishment. Sometimes we go into it knowing exactly what we're going to do. Others, not so much. In particular, the quilt back. How are we going to do that quilt backing? And sometimes we decide along the way as we're quilting, well, we can use some of these fabrics. Other times, not so much. We pull something completely different. Well, this is that for me. And I'm Leah Louise from Inspired Quilting by Leah Louise. And I am anxious to show you some ideas about pieced quilt backing, especially for a free quilt pattern. Oh my goodness, it doesn't get better than that. Let me show you what I have for you today. Here's a shot of the finished quilt after it's all quilted and the binding's on, and I think it looks wonderful. Look at those colors. They're just spread out everywhere, and you know what I think is my favorite is this raspberry. It just stands out, and I think it's beautiful. It's used in, both the borders, the narrow pieces, as well as the full-size 5-inch, and I think it's great. Oh, what a fun quilt. And this is the block we begin with, 25 charm squares laid out in a 5x5 pattern. You can tell these aren't sewn yet. These are just laid out on one of the first blocks that I made, and I was just having fun playing with the colors. There's so much you can do. You can get fussy with it so that they're in a particular layout, or you can just randomly place them throughout the quilt. Oh my gosh, they're just wonderful. It's such a fun way to do a quilt with so many different colors. It looks beautiful. This is a super simple charm square quilt using the disappearing patch method, and it goes together very quickly. And it's wonderful with lots of fabrics. These are not fabrics I normally would have chosen. This was a layer cake. My sister picked it out. She really loved the fabrics, and I thought, okay, well, let me give this a try. And I'm so glad I made this quilt. And these are perfect. Absolutely wonderful. I have a video previously that I did on how to make this. Right now, though, I want to show you about the backing that I've created and how I quilted this. The back of the quilt is made with 3 different fabrics. This is repeated twice on each side, and this is the center panel, though it's an offset. It's an asymmetrical layout, and then I have 2 narrow strips on either side of the center strip. But what's great about this is it's a wonderful way to use up your fabrics and piece them. If you have a wide piece, maybe some narrow pieces, however that works for you. Go through your scraps and see what you can piece together. I was fortunate that I had these all in the full length. This is about a 65-inch square quilt, and I had these in that length, so that worked out fine. But alternatively, you can easily set it up where you block these in and maybe put 3 or 4 different blocks in each panel or strip. What I do when I'm piecing my back and I want to have multiple colors and multiple strips, I do make an asymmetrical design. I don't want things strictly down the center. It just seems to break it up too much and create a divide, and the outside edges are just sort of left hanging. By doing it this way, you're spreading the pattern out a little bit, creating more of a design that keeps the eye moving and looking at all the different things going on. So I'll show you as best I can here. Like I said, we have a image that I'll show you in just a moment. This piece is about 15 inches, and I have 2 of these that are 6 inches apiece. And then I had an 18-inch strip of this wonderful batik. Actually, the whole back is done in batiks, but this is one of my favorites. This goes back at least 15 years. It's one of the last pieces I have, and it's the turquoise that attracted me. And I wanted to add more turquoise to this quilt, and I thought the back would be a great place to put it. So we have our grasses and a solid stripe and a wonderful print, and I repeat that solid stripe here, and then another wider piece for the other edge of the backing. And it just looks really pretty laid out this way. Let me go ahead and show you a full version of this. Here's a full view of the back of the quilt, and there are 3 fabrics. This was the primary piece that I wanted to use, and everything else worked off of that. This is a batik, really colorful, but I wanted to play off the blues and the turquoise in here. I put a 6-inch wide blue turquoise watercolor batik on either side, and then I had this fun grassy print with a multicolor that works with a lot of the same colors in this print down the center, and it works out really well. Now this larger piece was actually a full width of fabric. So I trimmed off the selvages and had about 25 inches here and 15 inches here. And that offsets this center strip set a bit that I think makes it look a bit more appealing. This is very easy to do. You don't need to have continuous pieces. I was just fortunate in this case that I did. But you can block these in using fat quarters or scraps that you may have or leftover blocks from other quilts. This can be done with multiple strips if you don't have a full width. Or if you do have a full width, then cut it into narrow cross sections and you know, ombre it or do a color gradation or just mix and match. The idea is to create a fun quilt back, piecing it with all the fabrics you have. We want to use up what we have hanging around that we're not using for whatever reason. We'll find a way to use it in your quilt back, and it looks wonderful. I love how this turned out. I want to show you a bit about the quilting. So once the back is made, I spray basted everything and got it laid out the way I want it, and then I decided just to do some easy cross-hatch quilting. And the way these blocks are laid out, and they're sort of different sizes and they're not all equidistant from each other, a crosshatch can be a little bit tricky only because you're generally lining up corner to corner. And on this one, what I found, when I started initially, I found out that I'm sewing corner to corner and I'm ending up off, and I'm not in the middle, and I couldn't figure it out. Well, here's one block. So if you see this block, we have our charm squares, and then we have these, which are half charm squares. Now, these finish, they start at 5 inches, and we do our seam allowance, so they finish at 4.5 inches. These are half charms, so they're cut at 2.5, and then when we sew them, they finish at 2. So these are not the same proportionately. So as I'm quilting and I'm going from corner to corner to corner, it works great in some of these spots, but where I'm going across that narrow piece, here's an example right here, where they don't quite line up, you see what happens? I come inside that corner on this direction. So it took me a while to realize I can't do anything about that. I was trying to angle my quilt and I'm thinking, what am I doing wrong? But when you have an asymmetrical square, well, actually, where is the square? Right here. There it is. You're not going to get an even space and have them all fall in the same places. And that's okay. Once I figured out what was going on and I realized I wasn't making a mistake in how I was, measuring or trying to quilt, I just started quilting and just doing the crosshatch. And these run just a little bit more than 3 inches. So that's a nice size block. And it works out well because these blocks are different sizes. They're sort of all over the place. And the fact that this quilting line isn't exactly in the center of each of these rectangles is okay because it doesn't need to be. And you may be able to tell I used a variegated thread, and it had lots of greens and orange and a lot of earth tones, a little bit of blue, and it just works great with all these colors. I think it turned out wonderful, and it's very easy to do. Now, one thing that I did do on this when I started quilting, the very first place I started was in the corner, and I know I've got a corner here somewhere. And I thought, okay, I'm going to start from this corner and work all my way down to the opposite corner. Well, when you're doing that with a basted quilt, you have a lot of bulk on each side. Now I had this spray basted, so it's holding together fine, but I just had a bunch to the side of my machine that I was trying to roll and wrap. My concern when I do that with a quilt that's basted is that it's going to shift or I'm going to stretch it. So what I did, instead of starting in the corner, I came down to the midpoint and I started my diagonal quilting here, and I went to the other side, and then I worked all the way out to the corner. So actually it's more than the midpoint. I think that was 1, 2. So this is 6 blocks wide, so I went down to block number 3. So I got this almost third of the quilt quilted with the diagonal, and then I was able to easily roll it up. And in doing so, it was so much easier to work from the center point across, because I didn't have to worry about this basting either moving or shifting, or the backing fabric getting wrinkled, because nothing's worse than after quilting finding out that you have a big wrinkle or tuck on the back of your quilt. So that was something that I've never done before, and it worked out really well. Also something I will probably do again in the future. So when you have a large quilt, you don't have to start in the middle. I've always generally started in the middle, because then I figure I'm equalizing everything as I move out to the edges. But by starting, at a midpoint, that also worked really well too. And like I said, the advantage was this whole side of the quilt was taken care of, and so I was able to come in and do this half. I came over, I did the other side of the quilt in the same manner, and did the other half of this center, and it worked beautifully. I also did it when I turned it around. Even though the other side was already quilted in one direction, it just made it so much easier to have this part quilted and not have so much bunched up under the machine. So that was just that was just something that I learned in quilting this particular quilt. I thought I'd share. You might find that helpful. But I always use my walking foot and a little longer size stitch than normal. I usually sew at a 2.5 to 3, and I think I quilted this at a 3.5, and it worked really, really well. I am pleased with how this turned out. This is a close-up of the quilting, and you can see the crosshatch is pretty much done, just corner to corner, where that was possible. Because of the layout of the quilt, it wasn't always easy to just switch from corner to corner, because there were, these rectangles in between, but you just sort of eyeball those spots and it works out fine. And the idea is just to get that general gist of the pattern laid in there, and just sew it in both directions. And these measure just a little over 3 inches, and I think that's a great contrast with the larger charm squares. It looks really great, and it's a fun pattern. The other thing that I did, I couldn't quite decide on what to use as my binding. I had some different colors that I wanted to try, and nothing was really getting me too excited. And I want to show you, I think, yes, it's this corner where you can see it up close. The first thing that I did is, after I quilted and I trimmed my quilt down, I used all the extra fabric, because you always have about an extra 3 or so inches on the outside of your backing once you have the quilting finished. You do that just for basting purposes. It makes life a lot easier to hold things together. So I took those extra pieces and I just cut them down, and I used a 2 1/4 inch binding on this, just because it's not particularly heavy, and sometimes that 2 1/2 can get a little bulky, but the 2 1/4 inch binding worked well for me. And these colors really work out fun. All these colors in the back, though they're brighter, they work well. They're very similar colors here. And this all works. Look at, some of these colors are almost identical. We have this raspberry here and the blues and the greens. So that worked out well. Now, the other thing I want to show you is I also use a decorative stitch in order to attach my binding. I think it's going to work better if I show it this way. It wants to curl over. I haven't pressed it yet. There we go. So what I do is I sew it to the back and I bring it to the front. And I use this blanket stitch. It's sometimes called the buttonhole stitch. But look how nice that works on here. You get a great, nice straight edge here, so it attaches, you know, the binding and holds everything in place. But I like that little extra stitch. It takes longer and it takes a lot more thread, but I love the look of it. I always used to hand sew my bindings, and I thought, well, if I'm going to go ahead and machine do it, I want to add something with a little pizzazz so it looks, you know, more interesting than just a straight stitch. And it's a lot more forgiving, because on a straight stitch, if you waver a little bit, it can be pretty evident. Whereas something like this, you're following more the pattern of the stitch versus how straight it is according to the edge. So all these things that we can do to camouflage make a difference. Here's a close-up of the binding. And you can see the decorative stitch here, the blanket stitch that I used around the edge. It just gives it such a nice finished look. I really like it. And I love how these colors work. Look, this chartreuse is here, and it's in these petals. This turquoise is in this quilt, in this fabric as well as this one. So even though this was just extra fabric that I used off the backing, it worked out great for the binding as well. So again, use what you have and make it work. You'd be surprised how beautiful it can come out. Now let me show you a quick overview of how to make this block and cut it and repiece it for the final quilt. These are the fabrics that I'm going to be using. I'm going to go ahead and get these cut up, and I'll show you where we go from there. There were 42 layer cakes, and I have 4 out of each. That gives me 168 5-inch squares. Now that would be fine if I'm, you know, just making the quilt that we're talking about, that the Fat Quarter Shop has done the tutorial on, but I'm going to change this. I want to make it a bit bigger. I now have 7 piles, and each one has 25 5-inch squares. I'm going to just randomly put these out. Now I have my 25, I'm just going to put that over here, and I'm going to sew them together. My blocks are all chain stitched into rows, and I have 5 charm squares by 5 rows. So let me show you our finished block. This is where we're heading, and you get it this way here. We're not going to quite get all of it on the screen unless I tuck it together here. And so now the next thing is going to be to cut our squares. And that's going to be very, very simple. There's absolutely no measuring. And if you've seen the tutorial that the Fat Quarter Shop put out, they did it in the simplest manner possible. So what we would do is just fold it this way so the raw edges are even. And then you just want to crease a little fold at each side, because that's where we're going to cut our blocks. Then we're going to fold it in the opposite direction so that we can crease this seam. So I'm going to turn it, and see, there's my seams that I've marked right there. You see that? The seams that I've already marked. I'm going to line these corners up. And now with this laying flat, I'm going to set this fold and this fold. Now you don't have to worry about if these line up. Chances are they may be off simply because that's the way it can be. And we're not going for accurate measurements specifically because we're cutting these in half. And that means that the seams are not going to line up. So if something's off, even, you know, up to 1/8 of an inch, you're not going to notice it. So our first one right here, if you can see that, we're going to line it up from here to here. I'm going to put that right in the fold, and I'm going to cut it. So let me go ahead and do this direction. So I'm going to go inside the fold there and inside the fold here. So now we have these 4 beautiful blocks. Now in the tutorial, the next step was simply to take these and turn them. So we have 2 small blocks. So you may recognize this as a disappearing 9 patch. Just instead of 9 patches, we're using 25. And it just allows for a lot more color and pattern throughout the quilt. Wow, I can hardly believe how quickly these blocks are going together. And you see we have the 2 small corners in the middle here, and then in the opposite corner we have the other 2. And that's what turns this pattern around and keeps these blocks going at different directions, which really creates a lot of interest in here. So the flowers, the bright colors, I mean, these fabrics just work great together and a perfect choice for this particular quilt. I love how this all just plays off each other. These colors are so bright. Look at that. Oh my goodness. And I just think this is beautiful. It's a fun one. You need to try this. So go ahead and grab some fabric and make your own. I think this would be a great one. So now it's just a matter of putting the quilt together and we're finished. I don't think I realized just how different the front and back of this quilt looks. It's okay, they don't need to match. It's almost like I have a spring version over here and a sort of a fall version here with these colors. But they're wonderful and it looks great together. It's a fabulous quilt and I'm really happy with how it turned out. I hope you enjoyed this. There was a lot of information, a lot of fun things to try, and hopefully you're going to get your own quilt made out of this pattern. It's a fun one. Have a great day. Thank you for joining me.